My dad was in headquarters company of the 3rd Battalion of the 345th. He was a communications sergeant. I've been working with the Legacy Group since our first meeting up in Washington, and am serving as your president for this year. One of the topics that I thought would be good, and tried to hit it a little bit at one of our sessions either last year or the year before, was the experience of a POW. And we have 2 sons whose fathers had that experience, and they're going to relate what they learned and some other things for you today. They are Dennis Lennon and Ron Crum here, whose fathers were both in 87th and were POW. So I'm going to turn over the program to one of them, and hope you'll enjoy it as much as I know I am.
Real well.
This is sound for an hour.
That's all right.
And no, that is not a prisoner of war camp there. That's a ex-Soviet submarine in Sevastopol Harbor. But, well, I'm Dennis Lennon, by the way. Can you hear me? I'll try to yell for everybody.
You need to.
Okay. I'm kind of a neophyte newcomer to the 87th Infantry Legacy Association. My wife and I discovered this about 5 or 6 years ago. My dad had already passed on, and he never reconnected with anybody because when he came back as a POW, they never sent him back to the 87th. Sent him to Fort Benning and discharged him. So anyway, he never talked about it. And I told somebody earlier, I said, this is kind of my I'm getting back on him because he wouldn't tell me anything, but I found stuff out. This is the result of a lot of research that I've done, what you're going to hear today. Ron's dad was captured, I think he said January 3rd. And they were already involved in the bulge and all that. But Dad was captured in the very first action that the division entered out of Metz, down on the Alsace-Lorraine border. Some of you guys were there, I'm sure. Over Gailback, near Gailback. There's some bad stuff going on there because it was the first action that the division got involved in. And my dad was captured on I think it was the evening of the 16th December 1944. And spent the rest of the war as a guest of the German Reich. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation I put together here, and let me bring it up for you. This is a magic button I just found out about. Hopefully it'll work. I call this a soldier's untold story because it would never tell me. Never tell me anything. I wrote a little article for GAN a couple of years ago about Dad's early experience in the military, and it only went up through the day he was captured. So this is kind of from the day he was captured on. If you'll see on this map of Germany and Europe, right here is where it all came down in that first action that you guys were involved in. Dad was captured there and immediately was taken out. Well, not immediately, it was about 3 or 4 days. He told me that he was actually in solitary confinement on Christmas Day somewhere near where he was captured, and then they sent him up to Stalag 12A, which is right here. And that's where he got registered as a POW. He got his POW number and his card. It's funny, Ron and I were comparing the cards that they got. What did I do with it? Where I put it. They look exactly alike. There's this really attractive precious metal here, which I have no idea what you think it is, lead. But they look exactly alike except for the numbers on them. And Dad kept this number the whole time he was a POW. He was at Stalag 12A, but he ended up several other stalags, and I'll tell you about that. I don't know how long he was held here, but sometime by early January, I think, he was all the way up here into Poland. And I never even knew what an Oflag was. all I had ever heard of was stalogs. Oflogs were officer-only camps. You know, they tried to separate the enlisted from the officers. Germans not realize that the enlisted guys were as smart or as better leaders as many of the officers. So they didn't accomplish anything by doing that, except just separating people. But anyway, he ended up there. Now this camp had originally been established for several other reasons, but it ended up being a U.S. officer camp for most of the war. And then on January the 20th, 21st, the Russians were just about right here, the Eastern Front. They were just about to overrun the camp. And the German the German guards and the camp commandant did not want to be there when the Russians arrived. So in the middle of a blizzard, they left on the 21st of January and began marching back across Poland into Germany and down into the central part of Germany. 45 days they were en route. So they ended up eventually at Stalag 13C, which is the first place that, if you remember the story, Patton sent a group of guys in to try to get his son-in-law,
Yes.
and they didn't make it. In fact, they got captured themselves. That was 13C. And then the head of 13C decided we need to get all these guys out of here, and they eventually moved them all down to 7A in Moosburg. That's where they were originally liberated. This was a huge camp by the time they were liberated. People from all different nationalities. So, that's just a little overview. This is a picture of my dad in 1933 as a buck private at Fort Bragg. So he was an old guy when the war came around. Like most of you guys were, like me when I joined the Navy, 17, we were kids. But he was an old man by their standards when he ended up in the war. But he was in 1933 he joined. He went over to the Philippines in the early 30s, came back in 38 as a corporal, and then he left the service, found a job with the Weather Bureau, and ended up marrying my mom. Then the war came about. He got recalled. By this time, he had some experience in meteorology, so they stuck him in what they call a barrage balloon battalion. Anybody ever heard of those? Somebody has. So he then was a sergeant, and what they did, they were in Paris, Tennessee, was where the outfit was, and they had to know the weather in order to figure out how to manage the balloons up in the air. So while he was at Paris, Tennessee, his commanding officer said, "You need to be an officer, and he kept bugging him to death, and so finally my dad just gave up and said, all right. So they sent him all the way back to Camp Davis, North Carolina, to OCS, got his commission, sent him back to the same company, where he stayed till about 1944. So he hadn't seen a lot of action until they were standing up the 87th Infantry Division. And you guys all remember what happened. They kept scavenging the division. Remember, they kept taking people out, sending them over as replacements. Well, they had to fill it up so they could ship you out. So Dad came. They sent him back to infantry officer school, and he came there as a first lieutenant before they deployed. Actually, I don't know how long he was there, but he had to have been there at least 6 months or so with the division, because he was in A Company 347 as the executive officer before they shipped out. He deployed, went all the way over to Europe with the A347. A little aside, which I've told some people about, is I couldn't figure out what happened, because on the roster of the division, it shows him in B347. And he always said, all of his documents showed A347. I said, how can this be? I figured that out through the research I did and how that happened. So he went into action, he got captured, and then this is basically the overlay of what the battle situation looked like on December 16th. There's a, oh, I didn't mean for that. This is 347 here, and I think this is the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, 1st Battalion. Dad was in the 1st Battalion, so he was evidently up in this area, and was captured because that was a piece of high ground overlooking Niedergelbach. They captured that piece of ground, and during the night the Germans came around and counterattacked and captured. Company B and Company A, they thought were wiped out completely, but they weren't. But Company B took a lot of casualties, and a lot of guys were captured. The reason he was in Company B is on the 12th of December, they flopped the XOs of those two companies. A went to B and B went to A. So that's how he ended up being captured from Company B. I figured that out through the morning reports and seeing the names. So I said one time to him, now you guys were in combat, you know how bad it is. And I was a kid, you know, came back from World War II, and I was playing, you know, cops and robbers and armies and stuff. And I said, Dad, how could you, with your guns and your rifles, how could you let those Germans capture you? I mean, couldn't you shoot them? I mean, he was so gracious, you know, he didn't slap me or anything. But yeah, he looked at me and he said, son, you don't have a lot of options when you're looking down the barrel of a Mauser and you don't have any ammunition. And he said to me that what happened is when they got to the crest of this hill or this overlook, they were out of ammunition, and all he was trying to do was get back to headquarters to get resupplied. They never got resupplied. And so they were captured that night. And he ended up back down in that town. Of course, the regiment took the hill back, and now we're shelling the town where he was in a POW. So it wasn't real pretty at that point for him, but they did boot him out. And this was 12A, where they took him the first time. The gate at 12A. Now this is a view of Oflag 64 in Poland, Szubin, Poland. This picture was drawn by one of the POWs that was up there for many, many months. And I'm going to read you, I'll go back if you don't want to read that, but I'm going to tell you the history of this place, if you'll bear with me. Poland, which at that time was occupied by Nazi Germany. It was probably the only German POW camp set up exclusively for U.S. Army officers, although other camps holding several nationalities were usually divided into separate national compounds. This camp was built around a Polish boys' school by adding barracks. You see, it looks like a pretty fancy place at first. Initially, it was Stalag 21B for Polish soldiers until December 40. Then it became Oflag 21B for French and British officers. Subsequently, for Soviet officers until June of 43. At that time, they were all moved out to other camps. The Commonwealth flying personnel to Stalag Luft 3 Saigon, others to Oflag 21C Ostresvitz. Anybody ever heard of Stalag Luft 3? That was supposedly where the Great Escape took place. And I met a man in Winston-Salem who was a POW in Stalag Luft 3 just recently, and he ended up at Moosburg 7A, the same time my dad did, and they never met. But in June of 43, the camp was redesignated Oflag 64. It became an American officers' camp with the arrival of about 150 officers captured in the North African campaign in Tunisia. In addition to the ground force officers, there were also a few aviators and a few enlisted men held at the camp. Over the next year and a half, the camp grew in size until on 21 January of 45, the roll call established a total of 1,471 men. Because of German concerns over approaching Soviet troops, all the men capable of walking were marched out toward Germany. The senior U.S. officer was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Good. In incidentally, when he got to Mooseburg, he was the senior officer of Mooseburg and took control of that camp and was the senior officer at the liberation of that camp. 2 days later, 23 January, the camp was liberated by the Soviet 61st Army. Still at the camp were approximately 150 Americans, medical personnel and patients, and a few men who had hidden in an abandoned escape tunnel. An additional 200 men had escaped from the marching column and had returned to the camp. The group that marched out of Subin reached Oflag 13B at Hammelburg on 10 March. They marched through snow and bitter cold for almost 2 months, covering nearly 400 miles. About 400 escaped on the way or dropped out 2 weeks to March. A number were shot. Part of the group, including Lieutenant Colonel Good, were again marched from Oflag 13B to Stalag 7A Mooseburg, where they were finally liberated by units of the 14th Armored Division on 29 April. So that's a little history of the camp town that my dad was living after the war, near where he grew up, Whiteville, North Carolina. So I went out there and I went through all their archives and I couldn't find anything. Finally, I went back over the article I had. I turned it on the other side, and I was looking at the ads and things that were on the back, and I realized that was a Wilmington newspaper. So I went back to Wilmington, went back in the archives that same period of time, and found the other 2 articles. So I got the whole interview, which was helped me put everything together. Before that happened, when I found out about Oflag 64, I couldn't put all the pieces because Dad had kept a record of his journey, the 45 days, on paper, day by day, what happened, where they were, what they ate, what the weather was like, those kinds of things. But I didn't have all the pages. When I found this Oflag 64 association, I found guys that had also kept diaries of the march. So I began to compare what they wrote with what my dad wrote, and it was like, it was a total fit. So I knew I had found the right place. And then when I got the newspaper article, I got all the rest of the information about the daily trek. So this is basically a recap of the 3 articles. Lieutenant Lennon was a native of Columbus County. This is a little bit of stuff he talked about his background. Let's start with this paragraph. Once he got to camp in Poland, the Russians began to push pretty close to where they were held, and the Germans decided to move them all. What transportation there was naturally did not fall to the lot of the prisoners, and they set out on foot from Subin, Poland, on what proved to be a 45-day, 353-mile march to Hammelburg. How Lieutenant Lennon managed to keep a daily diary of events is probably a military secret, but the fact that he did so provides us with a very illuminating description of what our prisoners of war in Germany undergo. With the understanding that this was comparatively good, though probably representative of what the average American soldier underwent. On January 21st, with a temperature at 20 degrees below zero, and heavy snow, I might add, the column of prisoners walked 22 kilometers through the town of Exton to a barn where they spent the night sleeping on threshed oats. This day they received no rations whatsoever, and available water was impure. The roads were blocked by thousands of evacuees as the Russians were coming on fast, but the prisoners had the right-of-way, and civilians drew to the sides to let them through. Horses were dying and babies were crying among the conglomerate masses standing in the 14-inch deep snow by the roadside. So, here is Subin, Poland, here. Here's where they started out, and here's the route they took. They went up to the Baltic Sea even. What I discovered was the guy, the German commandant, was keeping track of where the Russian front was, and he would move them whichever way he thought he could get the furthest away from them. So they didn't go straight west right away. They went up sort of northwest and then across and then down into Germany. So I've got a complete track of where they were day by day, and I'll run through these. And I apologize if this bores you, but it's really to me, just unbelievable to see what they went through as they went step by step. You see the dates here, January 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, so I'll get through those days. January 22nd, they progressed on for 26 kilometers to the town of Eschfield near Wierzitz. Now, you see Wierzitz, this is written in Polish, so you had problems with, the Germans renamed everything German names, and you got the Polish names, so it's going to be, you may not see the name that I say when you look at the date, so just bear with me there. They again slept in a barn. Rations for that day consisted of 1/4 pound of margarine with no bread, but some friendly Poles gave them hot ersatz. Anybody know what ersatz is? You ever heard that word? It's a synthetic coffee. That's what the Germans gave them to drink. Synthetic coffee. I don't know what it was made from. Twigs. The guards were very apprehensive that day and hurried them along away from the oncoming Russians. Crossing the Bromberg Canal, they noticed that the bridge was ready for demolition at any time. They heard Russian artillery fire, and there was quite an air of expectancy among the prisoners, hoping to be released by the Russians. They did all they could to slow up the column in hopes the Russians would catch up. On the 23rd, they went only 7 kilometers to Charlottenburg, where they found the usual barn awaiting them. The men had 2 blankets apiece, which they had to carry all day long in order to have any warmth at all for the night. The rations for that day were thin pea soup and a sort of meal soup and hot water. But the Poles gave them some potatoes and apples, which helped. On the morning of the 23rd, they awoke to find all the guards gone, and the American colonel had gone out in hopes of contacting the Russians, but to no avail. In the afternoon, the guards returned just in time to take away 2 pigs the Poles had killed, and which my dad was helping to dress, because he was a farm boy. He knew how to slaughter a hog, and he was trying to get it ready so they could have some food. But the Germans came back and took it away from them. By the way, the German guards came back because some SS troops came and forced them back. January 24th, after marching 9 kilometers, they arrived at the small farm village of Lobsons with their barn hotel in such poor condition that the snow came through the roof on them as they slept. The Poles gave them a little bread and cheese that day, but Lenin said saw a German officer beating a little Polish boy with one of the potato masher hand grenades for feeding the prisoners. They were told that in the future they would get SS troops to guard them, for too many were escaping. So that was through the 24th. On the 25th, they reached the town of Flatow, 20 kilometers further on their way, and stayed in a hayloft for the night. They were given a 1/4 loaf of bread, 3/4 loaf of bread, and 1/10 pound of margarine for rations. They crossed the border of Germany and found the people very glum and naturally unfriendly. The SS troops guarding them had a very typical way of clearing out the barns in the morning by spraying them with machine guns. This might cause us to think twice before grumbling at the alarm clock in the morning. That day they heard intense artillery fire behind them as they traveled down back roads in order to keep the main roads clear. On the 26th, I don't think they even show 26 on here. They stayed in Flatow, even though they had been told that they would move 2 o'clock on the afternoon. Instead, they got a welcome day of rest. In view of this, their rations consisted of 1 cup of weak soup and some water. Colonel Snyder, the German officer in charge, made a formal announcement of the recall of the Russian ambassadors from London and Washington, and tried to give the impression that the United States was now an ally with Germany in fighting the Russians. He did not fool the Americans, however, and when they brought in a captured Russian almost starved to death, the American medical officers worked to save him, although they were not able to do so, for he was too far gone. When he died, the Germans left him lying in the snow outside for 2 days. On January 27th, they took up the march and walked 18 kilometers to Jastrow, where they slept in a stable. They were fed oatmeal, a thin, almost soupy concoction, a 1/4 loaf of bread, and a little barley soup after this exhausting day. Here, 2 boxcars were loaded with some of the prisoners who were too sick to walk further. Y'all remember the 4x4s they talked about? Those 40 men, or what is it?
40 men or 8 horses.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's what they were. The next day, the 28th, column moved on another 18 kilometers to Zippernau and spent the night in a church. They had rations consisting of boiled potatoes and hot water for that day, and had plowed through deep drifts of snow in the bitter cold. Colonel Snyder, the German officer in charge, was forced to abandon his vehicle due to the depth of the snow. They found the town entirely evacuated. On the 29th, they reached Stalag 2D near Redrichstadt, which had been evacuated 2 days before. They had soup for breakfast and sauerkraut for supper that day. On the 30th, they progressed 14 kilometers to Machlen and slept in a horse shed, drinking ersatz and grass soup for their meals. Many of the men were completely exhausted, and the bitter cold increased their misery. It was very late before they stopped to rest. And Dad made a note in his diary, which I'm going to show you pictures of. Quartered very late, very miserable. On January 31st, they struggled on for 14 kilometers more, reaching Tempelberg in a barn for the night. They did receive a loaf of bread this day, and they met many columns of POWs being transferred in all directions. At the very end, I'm going to show you another map, and it's going to show you lines going everywhere. And it was total confusion in Germany. I mean, they were moving prisoners everywhere. It was just, had to have been wild. A short trip of 6 kilometers on February 1st brought them to Herrickdorf, where they received barley soup for breakfast and potato soup for supper and slept in a barn. The towns along the way were only partially evacuated. Dad's note was, toes very numb all the time. They stopped between the towns of Falkenberg and Dromberg the next night after marching 70 kilometers and slept in a very crowded barn. Rations were a little better here, being pea soup, loaf of bread, 1/10 pound of margarine. There was much German military traffic along the roads that day, and always one vehicle would be pulling 3 or 4 others. On February 3rd, they did not travel and received only 1 meal of potato soup. They heard the rumor that day that the Russians were only 26 miles from Stettin. A 17-kilometer hike took them to Bromberg on the 4th of February, and the walk was much better as the snow was disappearing and the roads were almost dry. They slept on a barn again and had ersatz and potato soup to eat. It was Sunday, so the Americans held a church service. So here they are. They're at this point right now. Now they're heading back to the northwest. You know how that arrow showed you? February 4th. February 5th, they walked 19 kilometers to Zeidlitz and were fed on boiled potatoes and cabbage soup. Here, 80 of the sick were put on boxcars. Their route previously had been towards Stargard, but here they changed directions. They went up this direction. On February 6th, they reached Regenwald. The name of the town means raining forest, and it certainly did rain, Lennon testifies. Those 22 kilometers were a very wet walk. They were based at a submarine school and were fed ersatz and the soupy oatmeal. They noticed a group of women POWs marching by them during the day. February 7th, after another 19 kilometers, they reached Lebanon in another barn where they received ersatz and cabbage. The towns looked rather normal, although there were very few men to be seen. February 8th, see they're at the Baltic Sea almost now. February 8th, they walked another 20 kilometers to Stuchow, all feeling terribly weak from the poor diet. They slept in a barn, had ersatz and boiled potatoes for breakfast, soup and potatoes for supper. That day, they observed an awfully long column of British POWs. On February 9th, they reached Stressau and slept in a hayloft after 17 kilometers. They were again given ersatz and potatoes, but Lennon was one of the few lucky ones who, he said, found some milk and had 3 cups. I don't know where he found the milk. He never said. February 10th took them another 14 kilometers, and they spent the night at the Luftwaffe Air Base on the island of Wohlen. This was a real Saturday night celebration, with ersatz tea and potatoes, and later potatoes and gravy. They were also given a loaf of bread, which they were told would have to last 9 days, as they would get no more. And they didn't get any more either. The German Air Force School was full of eager young boys with high morale and a firm belief in the motto prominently displayed, "Who would live must fight." Isn't that amazing? The Germans knew the war. The Germans knew the war was over at this point. But these young kids, they had gotten their brains messed up already and still believed that they would win. On February 11th, after a 14-kilometer march, they reached Nudendorf, and the barn where they stayed was extremely crowded. They received only ersatz and barley soup for food. The next day, February 12th, they reached Swinemünde, 25 kilometers away. This time, they were quartered at a German naval base and received gruel and ersatz as rations. Lennon was one of the few that got a hot shower here, but it weakened him so that he could hardly stand up afterwards. I couldn't imagine that, but that's how weak he was. This day marked the passing of the 200-mile mark on their long march. On February 13th, they reached Gartz, 8 kilometers further. And after eating potatoes and gravy, took a railroad ferry to the island of Usedom. The next day, they walked 15 kilometers to Stolp and slept in a barn, receiving potatoes, ersatz, 1/10 pound of margarine as rations. Colonel Snyder made an announcement of the day of rest for the next day. To their surprise, they actually got it. Their food for this day consisted of boiled potatoes, and 100 more sick prisoners were put on boxcars. On February 16th, they marched for 23 kilometers, finally arriving at Anklam and a barn. For rations, they had ersatz, potatoes, cabbage, and a package of nachbrat, a sort of concentrated cracker field ration, for the way they crossed the bridge to the mainland. February 17th was really a big day as far as the marching went. In their weakened condition, they marched 26 kilometers to Gutskow. They did get 1/6 a loaf of the brown sawdust bread with tea, potatoes, and barley soup that day. But Colonel Snyder made the best announcement of his career, in their opinion, when he told them there were some Red Cross food parcels for them. They were staying in a barn on the estate of a duchess who had a son in America as a prisoner of war. She called Berlin long distance and arranged for them a day of rest. The day of rest, February 18th, was also marked by the actual receipt of the Red Cross parcels. The prisoners felt this was due to the fact that their American colonel was to meet the Swiss delegation shortly and was going to give a full account of the treatment they had received. The Germans immediately got a truck and arranged for him to pick up 1 Red Cross parcel per man from a nearby prison camp. On February 19th, they walked on 12 kilometers to a barn in German. They received tea and potatoes that day as rations, but all of them felt 100% stronger after receiving the Red Cross parcel, so it wasn't so tough. On the 20th, they went 21 kilometers to Demmin and got 1/6 of a loaf of bread, some tea, and soup. There they met a British sergeant who said there were Red Cross parcels in the town, and the colonel immediately doubled the column back to locate them. The men were milling about in a confused state at this maneuver, but they finally did get half a parcel per man. These were half Canadian and half American parcels. The German colonel told them to save their food as they would need it when they were put on railroad cars, but they were so hungry they ate almost all of it anyway. February 21st was another day of rest, and they got 1/6 loaf of bread and soup. The next day, the 22nd, they went 17 kilometers on more of the same rations and reached Newfoundland. On February 23rd, after 19 more kilometers, they reached Nielchen and now had passed the 300-mile mark. Rations again consisted of bread, cabbage, and potato soup. On February 24th, they reached Grubenhagen, 22 kilometers past Nielchen, and received bread, potatoes, and turnips as food. They passed a lot of roadblocks for tanks on this day. So here we are down to the 24th and 25th. February 26th was the day of rest, and rumors were flying everywhere that there would be no rail cars available. This proved to be so, and meant that on February 27th, they marched on another 17 kilometers to Lutz, with only turnip soup and potatoes for sustenance. On this day, some German general also inspected the column. On February 28th, They reached the farm village of Seagull Cow after a 12-kilometer march where they received potato soup, half loaf of bread, and a half Red Cross parcel. Here they stayed until March 5th, awaiting rail transportation. On March 6th, they marched 10 kilometers to Parchin, where they found the boxcars. But Colonel Good, the American POW in charge, would not permit them to enter until a U.S. POW was painted on the top of each car. That probably saved just about all their lives. Because who would know from the air? They packed into the cars 42 men each and traveled this way through the 7th, 8th, and 9th of March, sleeping in shifts with 2/3 of the men lying on the floor at a time. They passed through Magleberg and Hallweiner en route to their destination, Hamelberg. Though they were issued a 3-day ration of meat, it was made into soup and they never actually saw the meat itself. On March 10th, they were settled into Oflag 13B at Hamelberg, and nothing eventful happened for about 2 weeks, so they just kind of milled about. On March 27th, this is what I mentioned earlier, some American tanks 60 miles ahead of the front lines broke down the fences and said, "Take off," to the prisoners. About 2,000 prisoners began rushing out and caused much confusion, but the Germans captured them all eventually, and even took the American tanks. This was quite a blow. On March 28th, they were moved to Nuremberg to Luft 3 and stayed there 4 days, after which they walked to Moosburg and actually gained weight on the march. Things were pretty, this is the gate of Hamelberg. That's Stalag 13B. And then, this is the map I told you about. You see all those arrows and lines? Those are directions that the Germans were moving POWs all around. And that's not all of them. I know there were others, but they were constantly crossing each other's paths, and it was just total confusion and chaos all over Germany. There is, here is Moosburg, and there is Hamelberg. So they came down through Nuremberg and then on into Moosburg, where they ended up. March, things were pretty confused and upset in Germany, and the prisoners were able to forage for themselves, catching chickens and rabbits and living off the fat of the land, such as it was. They came across some Red Cross trucks near Civitz and got some more of the life-saving parcels. On April 20th, they arrived in Moosburg after walking day and night in the rain. However, once they had crossed the Danube, they merely fooled along. After remaining in prison camp here for a week at Moosburg, on Sunday, April 29th at 7:30 a.m., the 14th Armored Division and the 99th Infantry attacked the town. By about 9 a.m., the American flag was flying over the city and the prisoners were free at last. So this shows the entire route of the journey that Dad took. This is the main gate of Stalag 7A, Moosburg. This is a huge prison camp, and that's an overview from the air of the size of this camp. And this is just a view looking out. And they were so big, they had a lot of temporary tents, and it was muddy and messy. And this is a picture of a lot of guys that were there as it was being liberated. So Lieutenant Lennon was transferred by truck on May 9th to an airfield, and by C-47 to Reims, France. There he took a hospital train to Camp Luxembourg near Le Havre. On May 27th, boarded a Liberty ship to New York, where he docked on June 9th. This account of Lieutenant Lennon's, though it is not the most gruesome to come from this war, though he left many of the discomforts to the imagination, is still a picture of what thousands of American boys have gone through, and which we should try to appreciate when we think in terms of the post-war world. So,
Is that the day of the liberation? They're all smiling.
yeah, that was I got some of these photos off of archives that I found on the internet. They weren't, necessarily. My wife said, wouldn't it be amazing if your dad's face was in there? I mean, how would you ever figure it out? I mean, but I think there were, at that point, not all Americans, but that was an incredible number. There's the main gate. These are the diaries for the journal that my dad kept, day by day. And see, this is page number 1. You see the number down here?
Yeah.
This will start January 21st, 22nd, 23rd. Talking about which town they went to, how many miles or kilometers they marched, where they were quartered, what they had to eat, and just general observations. And he did this every day. I mean, you know, you just couldn't keep any records. How he got the paper, how he got the pencil to do it, I have no clue.
Looks like this way. Quite a stack of paper.
So here you go, it goes from page 1 to page 3. I didn't have page 2. I didn't have those dates that were missing, but I found them when I read the article. And also some other people's diaries. And this goes all the way from page 3 to page 6, so I'm missing 4 and 5. You know, what he personally wrote. And then the very, again, 7 and 8 till he finally got to Schubert, walking 565 kilometers, 353 miles. And this is all in his handwriting, so I know it's accurate.
Did you see those when you were younger, or is that after he died?
After he died.
Is that right?
I just never knew any of this stuff. And my mother, she is so sweet. She's 95 now. She's still going strong. And I said, Mom, how about letters you and Dad wrote? Didn't you get letters back and forth? Yes, but I don't know why I didn't keep them. So, you know, none of that stuff I don't have. Now, this is an article I found also, if you're interested, on the internet called the Stalag 7A, The Liberation. And it talks about the entire surroundings when the American troops were forming up to go after Lewisburg, knowing that there were this many prisoners there, how they had to do it to try to keep from hurting them while they were taking the town from the Germans and stuff. So it's a really fascinating article to read. So if you're interested, be happy to let you take a look at that, and you can probably a reference to where it is on the internet, or I can get it for you. But anyway, that's the story of my dad's capture and incarceration and liberation and salvation. If you hadn't made it through there, I wouldn't be here telling you all this. So thank you for your attention.
Sir, how old was your dad the day he was captured, and was he captured alone?
I don't know that on the morning reports there are several other names that were identified as MIA, and I did find a couple of those guys were captured, but the rest of them were eventually KIAs. They found that they were actually killed. One guy was listed MIA, and he later on showed up again in a morning report and said he didn't get captured or killed that day. But my dad was born in 1914, so this was 1944. He had just turned 30. And my mother...
Were you born yet?
No, I was born in 46.
Okay.
My mother was in Wilmington, stayed in an apartment with my older sister who was 3 years old when she got the notice, first of all, that he was missing, and then later she found out he was alive, but didn't know when he would ever come back. So, all you guys that lived through this, and ladies that lived through all that time, my hat is off to you. I salute you. The greatest generation, we thank you for all that you did for this country. Any other questions?
Do you have this in writing at all?
This is what I've got it written out here. Yeah, I thought about making another Gann article, if that would be
We're
okay.
ready.
Is that all right?
We're ready for you.
Okay.
Take care of it.
I want to write one more article when I do some more research, and that was the fog of war surrounding his capture. I'm putting some pieces together about that, and so I don't, may not be absolutely accurate, but to the best of what I can understand that happened.
Barbara and I are gonna put our heads together and figure out how to keep the game going.
Okay.
Well, Tim, you're recording it, right?
Yep.
And so we're trying to make these recordings available.
Yeah, actually, up till today, everything's current on the website now.
Keep marching them around. I have a friend back home, he captured in the Hurtgen Forest before the POW. They marched some 600 miles. Two journeys, 300 miles each, just like they find, all around the place.
I mean, the Germans, who knows? And, I guess I'm grateful to some extent that he was in Europe and captured by the Germans and not by the Japanese. If you've ever read the book Unbroken,
Yes.
you find out really how the Japanese treated the prisoners there. And that's a fascinating book. Trying to think of the man's name. He was an Olympic runner.
Zipadelli, I think.
Yeah. So, any other questions? I know, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
I don't have as much nice stuff to show as Ron does, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. What Dennis referred to is, he said, I have some nice things. Some of you have seen a book that my niece Tina put together of a lot of things that we found in the last 10 years that my mother had saved for when my father was in the 87th, and a lot of things from letters, specifically like Dennis talked about, the letters that his mother didn't have. We were able to find, by going through an attic at home after my mother had passed away, we were going through some things in the attic, and basically in what amounted like a shoebox, my mother had kept all his letters from the war, and included in there were letters from the prison camp, and they're in this book here. So as you have a moment and want to read some of them, they're really, of course, very meaningful to us. For those who don't know me, I'm Ron Crum, and my father was Mailman Crum. He was in Company B346, and he passed in 2007. And I'm going to apologize already if I, at any time, get emotional. But anyhow, a little bit about where he was from. We're from around Hershey, Pennsylvania, and he grew up as a farm boy too. I always said they were poor and never knew it because everybody was poor through the Depression. So anyhow, he, again, a little bit about his background. He did his basic in Fort Knox because initially he was part of Armor. But then, as many of you all know, the 87th was pulled together by a lot of different ways, and he joined at Fort Jackson, taken out of Armor, became part of the infantry, and the rest is history. Basically, I want to straight. My mind goes all over the place sometimes. First thing I want to acknowledge is just how hearing Dennis's story just opened up a whole nother thing to think about. You know, you heard another story. Everyone in here has a story. You know, the veterans that are here, each one of you has a story, and everyone is precious, as we all know. But as I get to hear it, as we all get to hear it, just thank you so much for telling your story. And also, something that I thought, hearing about that march, and just like John asked the question, you know, why did they march them? Why did so many of those things happen? And the thing that overrides for me is, other than the grace of God, why weren't the prisoners just killed? You know, I think, why was my father allowed to live? Why was Dennis's father allowed to live? Only the guards or the people that captured them, you know, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but other than the grace of God, but we acknowledge that. Dad was captured on the 3rd of January, Geneville, Belgium, a little bit southwest of Bastogne, area of Saint-Hubert, and in that time frame, right around the beginning of January, that's where the 87th was. Tillet in that area, but a little village of Geneville. 7:30 in the morning, they were telling the story. They were holding a roadblock, and they were overrun. My father was shot at that time. He had 4 holes in his helmet, 2 entrance and 2 exit holes. One bullet creased his skull. He creased the top of his head. He had that scar his whole life, and so he always said they didn't have the last number in his serial number. He was allowed to live that. He was fortunate that it didn't have the last serial number. So when he was captured, he was also wounded. So a little interesting thing there too. When he was in basic training at Fort Knox, there was a man named Walter Drake, also part of the 87th. He was from Texas, and he and his wife and my father and my mother shared a house or a living quarters at Fort Knox. And they essentially lived together through the train-up period that they were there. So keeping that in mind, they had been together for quite a long time. Both of them became part of the 87th at Fort Jackson and went across together. They were both part of B346. They were side by side when they were overrun that morning on January 3rd. The sad part of that is Walter Drake, the way Dad talked, had basically a lot of his face shot away. And, just reflecting the great friendships you guys had, but then to be with someone when they are shot and killed, it just takes, again, it takes my mind to just a level. But one of the great things I tried to do, not a great thing I tried to do, but something I tried to do was try to make contact with his family, because I thought, sometimes they never know how their loved one died, over there. But I was never able to make contact with their family, but that was kind of something I wish maybe one day I'll still get to do it. Let's see. Another interesting, before I go on, Paul Jasper used to come to the reunions here. He was from the Chicago area. Haven't seen him in a number of years, really don't know what happened to him. But he was also captured about an hour before my dad was in the same area. And he walked up to me at the one reunion because he knew, always bring the Hershey candy. And he came up and he said he wanted to tell me how he believed Hershey saved his life. I got to drink something. I'm getting dry as So, of course, my ears perk up. I want to hear this. So he said when he was captured at 6:30 that morning, basically, he and the men with him had taken some German prisoners. So he talked about how the Germans were so, in his words, upset. They were fearing for their lives, and Paul and his friends, or his fellow soldiers, were trying to get these guys to calm down. So he told me he had a Hershey bar in his pocket, and he gave the Germans, the 2 German soldiers that they'd captured, some of the candy bar. And this was a gesture that, basically showed them that, look, they're not going to kill them, they're not going to, whatever. So anyhow, in the period of time, which was only a short period of time, maybe 15 minutes, half an hour, the tables were turned. They were overrun, and the Germans captured them. And it was becoming apparent to Paul that things weren't looking good and that they may be, killed themselves. But the 2 Germans that they had originally captured essentially pleaded to the ones that had just now recaptured them that these guys were okay, that they had given them chocolate and were very friendly to them. So again, Paul just felt the need to tell me how he believed, I could tell the story that Hershey candy saved his life, and of course, shared that with a few people back at work, so that always makes sense. Yeah, that's a good, that was Hershey saved her life. So anyhow, basically because my dad was shot, he needed some type of aid, some type of first aid. And basically, I guess through primitive means or whether they had their own, you carried your own first aid packs, I guess? And they said they used that and somehow tried to patch them up. But ultimately was taken to Stalag 9B in Badorb, B-A-D-O-R-B was the name of the town where that camp is. And that's the number on the ID tag like Dennis showed that his father had. I often wondered why he wasn't issued a second tag, because later in time my dad was transferred to a different prison, but their prisoner number was the same number no matter what stalag they were a part of. It helped me understand why he never had a second tag. But anyhow, basically the stories of the food, very similar like what Dennis described to you, the bad coffee or tea made out of something that wasn't coffee or tea. Potatoes or rutabagas or some form of soup, to sustain them. But again, not doing very well. On January 28th, like Dennis described too, where the officers were separated, my father was a corporal and then a sergeant through the battlefield progression. The non-coms were separated from the privates, and he went to Stalag 9A at Ziegenhain on January 28th, and from then he was a prisoner there until March 30th. They were liberated. It was Good Friday. A little bit later, I want to read the first letter that my dad wrote after he was liberated from Ziegenhain, but it was March 30th was Good Friday, and the 80th Division is who liberated that camp. And as far as my dad knows, he was the only one from the 87th that he was aware of that was at that camp. I haven't done as much research as Dennis has, but the internet is a great tool, and through different searches, I was able to find an account put to paper, because my father never put anything to paper. It was all just oral history. And like so many times when you hear someone else confirm or you hear the same details spoken about by someone that you've never met or never heard about, it can stop you in your tracks. Not that you ever doubt somebody that's telling you a story, but when it's confirmed by somebody else, it's a great thing, I think. And I found an account, like I said, that somebody put to paper that had virtually the same exact experience between moving from Bad Orb to Ziegenhain at the same period of time, the same dates, and some of the same accounts of what happened at those camps. And this was after my dad passed away, so I was never able to show him this, but it really stopped me. And I like to just point out a few things, and again, it kind of points out the struggles that they had. And after hearing about the march, I think that this really, not that it sounds better, but boy, I can't fathom the march for miles. But bear with me a little bit. I think this isn't too long. This gentleman writes, sometime around noon the next day, we arrived at a town called Bad Orb. We crawled out of the cars, and again, these are the 40 and 8 cars, and lined up for a long march which took us up to Stalag 9B on top of a mountain. I remember how the civilians stood at the curb and watched us. We were not exactly in a parade mood or mode. What shocked me was the way the youngsters would pick up a rock or bottle or anything they could get loose enough to throw at us. I guess we were spoiled by the attitude of the civilians on the station platforms. We were not very popular around this town. Let's see. We went through an interrogation process. This is one thing that Dad always pointed out, that when they were captured, it seemed like the guards or the people that were in charge knew so many details about who they were, what unit they were with, when they had left the States, so many details. Now, he always thought maybe somebody talked through the interrogation process. Maybe one of the prisoners broke down and talked and gave too many details. But it says, the interviewer made it clear to me that I was presently classified by friend and foe alike as missing in action. That's confirmed by some of the telegrams that my mother got. She never knew he was a prisoner of war until after he was liberated. He was only listed as missing in action, as was often the case. So, whether I was finally classified as killed in action or prisoner of war was his decision to make, meaning the interrogator. He already knew what unit I belonged to. I was wearing the patch of the 106th. This gentleman was with the 106th Infantry. He had a list of rosters and quickly found my name under the heading of Cannon Company 422 Infantry Regiment. With his blessing, I was permitted to get up and move to the ID station. I signed into a big book and was given a number. And he's talking about getting the ID number, as Dennis showed, and my father's is in the book also. It was a square piece of metal with perforations down the middle. The number appeared on both sides of the perforation, and it was suggested that I guard this tag very carefully. Another thing here. They're talking about food. You know, you can only imagine, you know, we have everything. And food was the topic. Dad would tell me food was the topic of many conversations among the prisoners. This gentleman writes, when we were not engaged in chewing and swallowing this precious stuff, and he was talking a little bit about when they got Red Cross packages, we all had lists that we scribbled on the backs of photos, and everybody loved the one for pound cake, the red. He says here, we talk about food all the time, and he talks about a recipe. Take 1 pound of butter, 1 pound of sugar, 1 dozen eggs, 1 something of milk, etc. And he goes, in fact, almost all recipes started out with, take 1 pound of butter. He says when it's all imaginary, one can afford the extravagance. He says, truthfully, prisoners of war were the only military outfit I ever knew or listened to where the subject of procreation was never mentioned. There's got to be some truth in the old adage that says the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So I thought that was, and again, I just recall my dad referring to that. Another thing that was confirmed here that my dad talked about says the U.S. Air Corps came to bomb our neighborhood late in March, about the 25th. It was the railroad tracks that they were after. Just like Dennis said at the end when they made them paint U.S. prisoner of war on top of the rail cars, Dad talked about being strafed in the camp by our planes because they didn't know necessarily that it was a prison camp or that there were Americans in there. And it says, in this case, it was the railroad tracks that they were after. Waves of B-17s came from different directions. There were at least 3 of them that I watched. We could see the bombs leave the aircraft and start to string out in a curve. We watched the puffs of smoke from the explosions, then felt the earth shake, and finally heard the bombing roll of a string of explosions. Later that evening, this is a part very vividly I remember my dad telling me about. Later that evening, the German army came to our prison looking for volunteers to go out in the night and repair the tracks. They had lots of German Shepherd dogs, lots of machine pistols, and funny-sounding flashlights that were actually hand-operated generators. As they squeezed the handles, the generators would whine and the light would fluctuate from dim to bright and back to dim. Volunteers, hell, they came for live bodies and we were chosen. I was among the chosen. I didn't think that I could walk further than a distance to the latrine, and I was marched at least 5 miles back toward town and the blasted apart tracks. Under the watch of armed guards, we shoveled ballast back where it belonged, laid the steel cross ties where they were needed, and placed the rails on top. Hard to believe, by 4 a.m. the Germans were able to run a locomotive through the area. So again, I remember my dad telling me about when the rails were blown up and they were forced to rebuild them. Let's see. Oh, another this one brought a smile only because in the day, probably like a lot of you, smoked. My father smoked at the time, and he talked about how they was such a commodity. They didn't have cigarettes, and if you had some, you know, they were the Luckies or the Camels with no filters, you know, would get down to the very tip, and then they would save that, and they would break it open and have the tobacco, and then they had some type of pipe mechanism to pass around and smoke what was left of the tobacco. And this gentleman writes, among my many pockets, I had managed to hide a briar pipe. This was passed around to those who had scrounged a little tobacco from the butts of cigarettes. And he also talked, I also had a deck of cards he has Kern, K-E-R-N cards. If you don't know what this brand name means, it describes a type of card that is printed on washable plastic. They were slippery, but we all got used to them. And again, talking about what they tried to do to pass time. You know, that was always something that they tried to find something to pass the time. The liberation. Dad liked to share how when it became apparent that the Germans were getting ready to leave, you could hear what they believed was American artillery. The time was coming, they believed they were going to be liberated. They just didn't know the details of when exactly or how. But there was a time when they were told they were going to have to march. They were going to vacate the camp and they were going to have to march. And it says here Captain Morgan, who evidently was the officer among them. For some reason, this Captain Morgan was there among the corporals and sergeants. My dad talked about confusing the guards. Essentially, he always tried to delay the enemy. Well, they didn't want to march because they believed if they would go out and march, they would probably be killed at some point if they were overrun. But this Captain Morgan had an idea. He said that we would all claim to be too sick to move and see what stalling might lead to. They went outside the barracks, and they counted off in threes, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And it says here, number 2 was supposed to faint, and numbers 1 and 3 were supposed to drag number 2 to the infirmary, such as it was. All this was going to take place just before they ordered us to march. Basically, what that did, the Germans evidently, they were trying to take a census of everyone that was there, and they could never come up with the right amount of prisoners. And ultimately, they became so frustrated that they just left all the prisoners in the camp, and they fled. So basically, this idea that they would feign getting sick worked. Let's see. Basically, on the 30th, when the liberation happened, what really essentially made a lot of them sicker than they already were. Keep in mind they were all malnourished, weren't eating much. I think my dad was somewhere, as far as I know, around maybe 160, 170 pounds. And when he got out, I think he was somewhere around 110. So, I mean, losing a lot of weight within 3 months. But basically, when the 80th Division liberated them, they were heaping rations upon these guys. And basically, their systems just, you know, if the prison camp didn't get them, eating the rich food was going to get them. So basically, after they started to do that, it became apparent that they shouldn't be doing that. The order was to stop, you know, giving them any food. I think that was shown, if you remember, was it in Band of Brothers, I think, with the way it was portrayed in Band of Brothers with the German concentration camp. They tried to give them food, but ultimately that was the worst thing for them. So basically, after the liberation, they had to be deloused. You know, they were infested with lice. My dad spoke frequently of how you would the lice would be on you, and they were just infested with lice. They had to be, you know, cleaned up, trying to give new clothes. Of course, nothing would fit properly. It was just whatever they could get. They were flown back to La Harbe, Camp Lucky Strike. He was in a makeshift medical hospital or ward there until he was strong enough to sail back to the States. I think he said on May 8th on VE Day, he was about halfway across on a ship at the time when VE Day happened. He came back, was rehabilitated at a few different places, and essentially too never became back part of the 87th. He was discharged from Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania, near our home, but he never came back to Benning to be discharged with the 87th. So one thing I want to read to you, like I said, about the letter that he wrote. And this is dated April 3rd. So that would have been, Tuesday. They were liberated Good Friday, and this would have been the Tuesday after. And all these letters from the prison camp never reached my mother till after he was liberated and well on his way home. So again, she never knew he was a prisoner of war. He writes, "My dearest wife and family, well, honey, this is my first time to talk to you on American paper for a long time. I am a free man again. I was recaptured by the USA on March 30th. I am still okay and in the best of health. I hope you are the same. I expect to be moved from here in the near future. I have no address, so don't write to me. I was captured on January 3rd at 7:30 in the morning. When I get to see you, I will have plenty to tell you of my prison days. I hope you and the baby, which is Millie, my mother gave birth to Millie while my dad was in the prison camp, so you can imagine, she didn't know if she had a husband, and my dad didn't know whether he had a little boy or a girl. Let's see. Are we doing fine? And have a nice name for it. So she was an it. Let's see. I sure would like to. Oh, okay. He asked something else. The bottom line, the last paragraph he writes says, "Tell Daddy and all the rest about me. I feel so good I can't tell it in any words. On Friday was the happiest Good Friday I'll ever spend." And then he closes. Like, again, just reflecting on what freedom must have tasted like to him and all the other ones, the picture that Dennis showed. I always think freedom has a taste that I'll never be able to feel like those gentlemen did and any of the others, So, hope I didn't ramble too bad. I tried to hit some major points, but let's see here. Oh, another just one finishing thing. In 2010, I was able to take a trip back. The second time I was back with the POW group, and just like I always use the example, like up around Gettysburg, where we're from, there's local folks that are really historians and know where every regiment of every army was on a certain day and time. There was a gentleman back around Geneville, Belgium, that is pretty much the same way, and he was able to take me to where he believed the roadblock and the part of the woods where my father was that morning. So that was real meaningful. I know it was a much different place that morning, but it certainly sent chills through your spine. So, yeah. Any questions?
I have a question for all the guys from the 87th that you wore your dog tags, right? Yeah, when I was in the Navy, I had a set of dog tags. I always had 2 dog tags on there. Why? Fred.
The reason, one dog tag went with a body, and the other was sent to records or, and maybe eventually came back to the family.
That's still, the Germans had a single, all the German soldiers had tags like this too. And I always wondered, I found out in doing this research, if you look at this tag, there's a little, it's perforated down the middle. The same information on both sides. So what they did is they broke them off. And I never knew that until I started doing this research, but I thought that was kind of fascinating.
It was the same idea to send one with the body.
Yeah, one stays with the body and one goes back.
Today, my son was a Marine, and during the Iraq War, he actually had to have one tucked in his boot. In his, not only did he have two, he had one in his boot because of being blown.
Yeah.
Armed that if there were any identifying parts of.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a question, maybe you could answer, somebody could answer for me. When we was in Buchenwald, I talked to a man there, he said he was an American citizen, said he was Jewish. And, he gave me some memorabilia, and he gave me a tag, it was oval like that, and it had slots, and his name was the same on both sides. And he said that was for the prisoners that was in the camp. Now, if they're gonna exterminate those people, why did they go through all that trouble of making that tag? I still have the tag.
Germans like to keep records.
Yeah,
Love to keep records of
yeah,
everything.
but what are they gonna do with the tag they give to the guy that they're gonna cremate?
I don't know.
You know, it may have been part of the psychology of moving people. For example, at Buchenwald and some of those camps, the people coming into those camps saw on the railroad station, they saw the dates, the times that trains would depart and the times that they would arrive, and it made them feel like it was a regular station. That was all phony. It was just to ease the concern of the people there so they'd be able to handle them better. That's all.
Okay, well, it's probably part of the psychology of it.
The psychology of it.
Okay. Thank you.
One of the questions I had asked Dad when he was still here is if he ever was mistreated, if he ever felt he was beaten and he said no. He said he had never been, he believed, mistreated or anything, you know, that in his experience, you know, the guards and, you know, the ones that were caring for him basically.
Did he have to endure any long marches?
No, he didn't talk of that, no. Didn't talk of any forced marches in his experience. Talked about the rides in the 40 and 8 cars, you know, from when he first, wherever the trip to Bador from Jenneville, wherever they took him behind the lines when they captured him. He talked more about that and the discomfort of being crammed in these 40 and 8 cars. They put more than 40 people in those.
A fellow I mentioned earlier that I met recently, who also was a POW and ended up in the same camp, 7A. His name is Jules Spock, and he's right in my hometown. I didn't even know him until just recently. He was a B-25 pilot and was captured during the Italian campaign. His bomber of a march. There's one in his book. He wrote a book called All Roads Lead Home. It's probably not publication anymore, but I found one on Amazon, and there's some more out there. And he was telling me when I met him, we talked, and he wanted to know about my dad, and I wanted to know him in case there was, you never know, strange things happen that he may have known my dad or they came across each other. So he was telling me about this forced march that they had to do from Luft 3 down to Moosburg, and it was 3 days. He was just, I had to march 3 days. And then I found out my dad was marching 45 days, but it was the same cold winter time. But his people were put in those 4 bays for 3 days without stopping, and there was no place. I mean, I hate to. You can use your imagination. You know what they smelled like and looked like when they came without stopping to go out to do the things you need to do. Crammed in there. So, I mean, some excruciatingly bad things happen to people during those times.
Items, I mean, my father didn't have the march, but talking about being so cold, no heat, sleeping 2 and 3 men on top of each other just to try to keep it warm in some way. During that winter that everybody talks about how cold and how snowy it was, they were just in unheated buildings with no, nothing. Another thing, and maybe your dad was the same. When it came to growing up, and again, the same story of, Dad didn't speak of anything really until much later in life. But when dinner time was at home, and maybe this is the same with all of you, his plate could always probably been put back into the cupboard, and it was that clean. There was never a speck left. And pretty much we were expected to be the same way. I mean, there was no waste. And also the phrase, if somebody didn't like something, or if there was any kind of misuse of food, he'd say, "You've never been hungry."
My dad would, grew up, I hardly ever ate a potato growing up. Asked my mother, why do we have rice on it? I love rice. I have nothing against rice. But we always had rice, rice and gravy. It's just rice and gravy, everything with any kind of meat. She said, your dad does not like potatoes. He would not eat a potato after he came home.
So if not, Jim?
About a clap, huh?
Thank you very much. Karen and I are going to say a few things, but let's say welcome to our senior 95-year-old Walter Clark. Welcome back. Thanks very much, guys. Those are real two personal stories that I know kind of tough to tell sometimes. Before Karen and I tell you a little bit about the trip tomorrow, let me introduce Dennis McCarthy to you, who is our vice president, or one of our vice presidents, and he's going to be in charge of the forums on Friday and Saturday. So if you want to give them a quick, tell them what we'll be looking for on those 2 days, Dennis.
Well, one we're calling American Ingenuity. We're getting my Uncle George to tell a story about things he did, and some things I did in Korea, and then my nephew, who was an F-15 fighter pilot, talks about some of the things he's done in regard to not following things the way or you were told to do it, or even ordered to do it, but you got your mission done. So it's a matter of we're thinking outside the box, making sure that we get things done that need to be done. And then the other topic, I had a little get-together with my uncle and brothers, and Uncle George said at one time, I called for close air support at one point, and I was told, the ceiling's too low, and then we're strafed by the Luftwaffe. And my nephew is a colonel now. He said, how come? So he's researched that, and he's going to explain why.
Okay, thanks very much. Glad to see you guys here, Tom. I made some pictures at a graduation 3 weeks ago here that you're going to be seeing tomorrow, but I don't think I'll run through those. I mean, you can see it tomorrow. Let me tell you a couple of things, and Karen's going to cover things. The most important thing, and listen to me now, is to pace yourself tomorrow. We've got more planned than we should have, but there's just some rich stuff there at Fort Benning that we want you to see as much as you can. But don't try to show out, early in the morning that I can walk a mile if I need to. Just save that till the afternoon, okay? We're going to have several wheelchairs. There'll be a golf cart, I think, both in the morning to move you down some to the viewing area. So just be patient and don't exercise too much too early. In the afternoon, if you want to dance in the evening, that's okay. But just take it easy tomorrow. Just by a show of hands, how many of you were ASTP and took basic at Fort Benning? Raise your hand if you did on that. Okay. Sir?
I took a betting, is that what you're?
Yes, sir. Looking at it.